was watching TV with my dad, and I must have been about 15 or 16 years old, and Alice Cooper was on TV, and all of a sudden I hear this voice, and it's my dad, and he looks over at me like this, and he's talking through his teeth like this, and he's really mad. If you ever look like that, I will kill you. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, yeah, Dad, wait till they get a load of me.
Gentlemen and other androgynous creatures, I bid you welcome to my all-time favorite heavy metal band. A band with no bad songs and no bad albums. The year was 1976. Blackie Lawless, who was still going by his God-given name as Stephen Duran, and at the time, a ripe old age of 18, joined the New York Dolls, replacing the outgoing Johnny Thunders. However, unbeknownst to Blackie, the New York Dolls were on their deathbed, and within 6 months they were deader than disco. Blackie and Dolls bassist Arthur Kane booked a one-way trip from New York to Los Angeles, clouded their lungs with that beautiful LA smog, and formed the Killer Kane Band, which lasted about 5 minutes before Kane became disillusioned with being in bands that went nowhere at the speed of nothing. Blackie then shacked up with Randy Piper, formed the once-again short-lived band Sister, along with Lizzie Gray and eventual Motley Crue tyrant, bassist Nikki Sixx. Sister once again didn't go anywhere and dissolved faster than an Alka-Seltzer tablet in a bottle of Coke. Nikki and Lizzie would go on to form the glam metal initiation band known as London, which Blackie himself was briefly a member of, before eventually forming a band called Circus. Blackie Lawless, along with Randy Piper and Tony Richards, as well as employing, albeit briefly, a bassist known as Rik Fox, formed a band that would be ultimately known as W.A.S.P. You see, it was Rik Fox that suggested naming the band W.A.S.P, but it was Blackie's idea to add the periods in it. What does the acronym WASP mean? Well, that is a matter of debate, as Blackie never really gives a straight answer. In fact, he usually gives different answers, like "we ain't sure, pal," or my personal favorite answer, the Chandler Bing level sarcastic.
It's a bug.
Though the vinyl of the self-titled debut has an engraving near the label that reads, "We are sexual perverts,"
Blackie was known for his unique vocals. Some might even say he sounded like a wasp, but he almost didn't have a voice at all.
I ruptured the whole left side of my voice. And so there was a doctor in Los Angeles, and he was a throat specialist. And this guy was impressive because when you walked into his office, most doctors have their little certificates on the wall of what school they went to and things like that. This guy's office, floor to ceiling, all the way around it, every wall, gold and platinum records. And he says, "Okay, I'm gonna tell you the truth." He says, "You got a serious problem here. You may never sing again. But if you do exactly what I tell you to do, I'll get you through this." He says, "The first thing that's going to happen is you're not going to speak for 6 weeks. The phone rings at your house, let it ring. You go to a restaurant, you take a pen and a paper, and you write it." So this went on for 6 weeks. The temptation when that happens is to test it from time to time to see if it's there. It's like being in this deaf, dumb, and blind hell.
Rik Fox was out of the band fairly quickly and went on to form a band with Ron Keel and Yngwie Malmsteen by the name of Steeler, while W.A.S.P went through a few more bassists to the point where Blackie just said "f*** it" and begrudgingly took on the bass duties his goddamn self. But with Blackie on bass, the band now needed another guitarist, one that was good enough to stand up against the rivaling bands of the likes of the amazing Mick Mars of Motley Crue or George Lynch of Dokken. A guitarist able to work well with his fellow band members to the point where they would be worthy of being compared with the Iron Maiden duo of Dave Murray and Adrian Smith and the Judas Priest duo of Glenn Tipton and KK Downing. And after finding him in, of all places, a Hustler magazine, Blackie found his men. Enter Chris Holmes.
If you're familiar with Hustler, there's a section in the back called Beaver Hunt, which is where all these voyeuristic men send these somewhat less than professional snapshots of their wives in and what have you. And they always have one for the ladies usually, and it says for ladies only. Well, I looked at it and here's this blonde thing standing there, and it's up underneath it says rock and roll animal, and I showed it to the drummer at the time. I says, look at this goof.
Now the question was, could Chris Holmes do the daunting task? In the realm of heavy metal, very few figures captivated audiences, and even fewer left an indelible mark, quite like Blackie Lawless. But Blackie really made a lasting impression when he started tying naked bitches to the torture rack, hurling raw meat into the audience, and drinking blood out of a skull and spitting it into the audience. And it was this talent that sparked the interest of Iron Maiden's lifelong manager.
There's a club here in Hollywood called Rainbow Bar and Grill. There was a girl there that I knew, and she was sitting with this guy named Rod, and he says, aren't you such and such? Because I had been on the cover of an issue of an English magazine called Kerrang, which he was familiar with. And he says, yeah, I've seen you guys. And he starts going on and on and on about things that he didn't like about what we were doing. And I thought, who the hell are you? You know, I mean, I never met this guy before. So about 3 months goes by, and we were getting ready to play a show in Hollywood at the Troubadour. It was a special Halloween show, and this magazine I spoke about, Kerrang, had sent a photographer, Ross Halfman, out to do some photos of us. And Ross shows up, and he brings Rod along with him to this Halloween show, and Rod said he was coming along for a goof, you know, he didn't take us seriously or what have you. 2 days later, after we play the Halloween show, I'm walking through this Rainbow Bar and Grill again, and there's Mr. Rod Smallwood sitting there again. And he grabs me by the arm and he pulls me down in the seat and he immediately starts in on me about what I'm doing wrong. You're doing this wrong. You're doing that wrong. You're not marketing right. I go, who the fuck are you? You know, I says, here, I'm managing this band by myself and I'm doing this and I'm promoting it and I'm doing all this stuff by myself and I have no help and no money. And I says, where are you coming off from to tell me this stuff? Now, the first time I met the guy, I hated him. And the second time I met him, I liked him even less because now he's really coming down on me hard. Well, after we talked for about an hour, it dawned on me that he had designs on what we were doing, and he saw something there.
It was time to get noticed, and it all started with quite possibly the most controversial song of all time.
Somebody was asking me the other day how I got the idea for the song Animal. I said I hooked up a videotape in my bedroom, rolled it back, made it rhyme. Animal was a song that, because of its highly controversial lyrical content, was a song that people said would never get a lot of attention. We got a gold disc for it.
Animal Like a Bass was supposed to be the opening song to their upcoming debut album. That was until the literal government intervened.
We wanted it on the album, but there was a problem with EMI in England, and there was a huge controversy that the local government there had threatened the EMI officials that if they put that single on the record, they were going to go to jail.
Smallwood knew the band had a golden goose egg, and he was damned if he was going to let it get buried.
He had already walked this path before with Iron Maiden, so he knew where to take it and where to put it. And it was Rod's idea to do the single for the 12-inch for Animal, for Fuck Like a Beast, because when EMI said they didn't want to release it, I thought, well, then that's it. That song's going to get buried. And Rod said, You know, life gives you lemons, you make lemonade.
By the time the debut came out, it was one of the most anticipated heavy metal debut albums in the entirety of the 80s, if not in the entire history of heavy metal.
Tell you, I'm intense. I should have been born triplets. I got 3 times the intensity, 3 times the sex appeal, 3 times the macho any man alive. You know why the guys all come to these shows and you never see girls? Because all the guys got their girls home locked up. They don't want them to come home sitting here seeing us because they go home getting the Vaseline thinking about us. That's why they never come out here anymore.
From the beginning of Animal Fuck Like a Beast or I Wanna Be Someone, depending on the version of the album you have, to the final notes of Show No Mercy. This album is unrelenting in its bitchiness. The biggest standout song for me after all these years has to be the catchier than the clap tune by the name of Sleeping in the Fire. Although this song sure as hell didn't win any points with the Satanic Panic Brigade, but it was the 80s. People were calling Iron Maiden satanic for making a song about literally calling the police on a satanic ritual. Worst song?
You won't catch me with those trick questions.
But most 80s cult film aficionados will recognize the song Tormentor, as the song and the band were featured in the It's So Bad It's Good B movie, The Dungeon Master. A stronger than Schwarzenegger debut for effect, but would W.A.S.P fall victim to the sophomore slab? Sorry, I can't even finish that sentence with a straight face.
We've got some things on the inside of the album sleeve that you'll see this time, which is called The Last Command, which will be out relatively soon, where you slide out the inner sleeve and it's a picture of our 4 heads on stakes, and you'll see those heads on the stage and the eyes light up red and fog comes out of the mouth and nice little things like that. Creates lasting images when a kid tries to go to sleep at night. You know?
I do think the single biggest difference between the first record and the second record was that the record company, EMI, insisted that we use an outside producer, and it gave it a polished sound. One that I wasn't ready for. Somebody said later it sounded like you went from your first album to your 4th album.
But honestly, at this point, who the f cares? Because The Last Command on its own terms is a masterful album and an even more masterful sophomore effort. Whether it's the inebriated cowboy theme song, Blind in Texas, the anthemic title track, or the catchier than COVID Running Wild in the Streets, this album is merciless and a non-negotiable classic 80s heavy metal album and a required purchase amongst its predecessor. Most bands can't one-up their hit song on their debut album within 5 records, but W.A.S.P, with the immortal Wild Child, did it in exactly 1.
I want you.
But don't let that melodic progression confuse you into believing that this album is an outright severance of the band's roots. There's plenty of sleazy sex metal in songs like the Lesbo Nymphomaniac anthem, Ball Crusher, and the autobiographical Sex Drive. It goes even further into that, evidenced by Cries of the Night being a recycled track going back to the Killer Kane band entitled Mr. Cool, which was also a standard in the set list of the pre-W.A.S.P incarnation Circus. This album is also the beginning of the long-standing tension between Blackie and guitarist Chris Holmes. You probably have noticed that the debut album has all of the band members on the album cover, whereas The Last Command just has one certain frontman on it, while the rest are buried on the back of the album sleeve.
Well, yeah, this is a record. This is all people in the band, you know, right?
Yeah.
Okay, then we do a record, we tour, we have a good time. Second album, is that a band? No.
Yeah.
But Blackie was ready to move on to bigger and better things, but before he could do that, he had an international pain in the dick standing in his way.
We were commencing work of the second album called Last Command. And right about that time, there was this wonderful organization that cropped up called the PMRC. And the PMRC stands, theoretically, for the Parents Music Resource Center. They're an evil organization in the sense that whenever you dictate to someone how to live their lives between now and 20 years ago, things should be left to the individual as to what they think they should or should not listen to. If you don't want to listen to what we're doing or you don't want to watch it, then don't buy it. Don't go see it.
Founded by the so-called Washington wives of Susan Baker, wife of Treasury Secretary James Baker, Pam Hauer, wife of Washington Realtor Raymond Hauer, Sally Nevius, wife of former Washington City Council Chairman John Nevius, and the Karen of all Karens herself, Tipper Gore, wife of Tennessee Senator and future Clinton Vice President Al Gore. This lovely on opposite day organization known as the PMRC, conducting a must-listen-to playlist dubbed the Filthy 15, mainly comprising of hard rock and heavy metal bands such as Judas Priest, Motley Crue, AC/DC, Twisted Sister, Def Leppard, Merciful Fate, Black Sabbath, Venom, and of course, W.A.S.P.
Tipper Gore, who is Albert Gore's wife, has written a book. She is the head of the PMRC. She has written a book called Raising PG Kids in an X-Rated Society. And it was bad enough when they used us to get publicity out of. And I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. What better way to get attention than to go after an attention getter? That was one thing. But when she wrote this book to fuel the fire for his presidential campaign and was using me in that as well. To pick on me is one thing, to make money off of me is another, and the buck stops here literally on that. They have reprinted lyrics in this book without permission. They've changed the lyrics, which I ask myself, if our lyrics were that bad to begin with, why'd they have to change them?
W.A.S.P. had 2 phenomenal albums and 2 extremely successful world tours done and dusted, but it wouldn't be long before W.A.S.P. found themselves in a circus of the electric variety.
The Electric Circus with Blackie Lawless and W.A.S.P. and I don't need no doctor. Yeah.
Somebody had carried a rump roast about this big around, and it was like about 32, I'd say about 22 degrees outside. It was frozen, and this kid had thrown it up on stage and smacked me in the face. That's like getting hit with about a 50-pound rock.
I guess the mystery's been solved on what caused Chris Holmes to become brain-smashingly retarded. Chris wasn't the only one to take a beating on tour, as Blackie himself had pretty much developed a full-on fucking fetish for being set on fire. Not once, but twice.
Well, when we did the Troubadour shows, we had the sign, big W.A.S.P. sign, big letters, and we had these flames that go off around it. But we had different heights that we could put this sign to different places. Well, at that time, we got it down one click too low. When Blackie went up to start it with the torch, his hair was up, had all the hairspray. And when he lit it, his hair lit. And these kids up in the front, they're going, "Yeah, burn, Blackie, burn!"
There is an apocryphal story, actually, about a chap called Blackie Lawless, who plays for an American group called W.A.S.P, who supported us on tour. He has one of these things. It actually has a plastic chainsaw blade that comes out of the front of it. And he has a firework inside, which, at a given signal from the appropriate whatever, I don't know if it's operated by somebody else. I think he operates it himself. The firework explodes, so you get this tremendous kind of, sort of, pelvic thrusting with this thing, and suddenly up goes the firework. It's very spectacular. And in fact, there is one case on record when it exploded the wrong way with, I think he had to be taken off to sort of, not quite intensive care, but care anyway.
By the end of the Last Command World Tour, W.A.S.P. would begin their long history of lineup changes as the long faithful until this point guitarist Randy Piper left the band, and while his riffs and tone are certainly missed, it was a bit of a blessing in disguise for Blackie.
Randy was going to be leaving the band. We knew that already. So it was a perfect opportunity for me to go back and play guitar. So I told Chris, I says, I really don't want to play bass. I call bass a tool of ignorance. And so I said, well, let me go back playing guitar, because I'm a guitar player by trade.
But the resulting album that followed was anything but an absolute terror for Blackie. And while it's still an exceptional album that has no bad songs, this album was entirely made to fulfill contractual obligations, and the result...
That was the biggest pile of crap ever recorded by any band in the history of the recording industry. That was a tired record done by a very tired band.
And on some songs, you can absolutely tell. Emphasis on restless, but while songs like Restless Gypsy, Easy Living, and Sweet Cheetah sounds like Blackie was having trouble staying awake during the recording process, even then, those songs still somehow kick ass. Other highlights include the exceptional 9-5 Nasty, albeit parts of this song sounds like something Def Leppard could have released on Hysteria. Like the heavily underrated Judas Priest album Turbo before it, I deem this album all filler but killer. This album quite possibly features Chris Holmes at his best, which probably isn't entirely shocking considering his party lifestyle and his main interest in the sleazy Motley Crue metal that he so desperately wanted to be a part of long after the death of glam metal. Unlike most heavy metal rock stars in the 80s who careened out of control to the point where they either crashed and burned or died, Blackie, being Blackie, slammed on the brakes and took his time. He recorded the best soundtrack theme song of all time in Scream Until You Like It from the soundtrack of 80s B-movie horror classic The Ghoulies 2. Top 3 easily, as well as cranking out the exceptional Live and the Raw Live album to fulfill contractual obligations. As far as he was concerned, he was done with cashing it in, selling himself out to make Motley Crue metal to fit in with the rest of the 80s metal movement. No, this time, it was time to pull his skull out of his fucking small intestines and make sure that the upcoming album was a major departure from the albums that preceded it.
The Headless Children was after we would watch the news at night and we would see anybody doing anything wrong to anybody anywhere in the world. I mean, that's really who the Headless Children are. Every time we saw, a plane getting blown out of the sky or some other catastrophe happening. And immediately everybody's going to think out of us, well, W.A.S.P, the Headless Children, what are they doing now? It's not that at all. The Headless, well, the title track is an anti-nuclear war song.
After a year break to recuperate and bathing in the blood of the PMRC, while Motley Crue is releasing the biggest sellout to date, W.A.S.P cranked out the almighty Headless Children. This album does not contain an ounce of filler, let alone any of their sleaze metal exploits from the first 3 records. The closest this album even gets to something sounding remotely similar off the first 3 records is the Chris Holmes inspired theme song, Mean Man. Which finally brings us to one of the main new additions to W.A.S.P's subject matter, and a subject that would remain front and center for pretty much every W.A.S.P album to come: politics. If you haven't guessed it already, Blackie is heavily politically aware, and while I normally don't care for politics being mixed in with music, an opinion I apparently share with Alice Cooper, Blackie, while having fairly conservative views, doesn't just pick on the opposing side. Racism, Jimmy Carter, H.W., Tipper Gore, the Clintons, W., Obama, and the subject of this album's song, The Neutron Bomber, Ronald Reagan. But unfortunately for Blackie, while this album was a deliberate pivot out of the 80s glam metal scene to a band that actually talks about real shit, the only W.A.S.P-related news story people were at all interested in at the time was Chris Holmes and his drinking problem.
When you were a little kid, did you want to be a rock star?
Yes, I did. Definitely. But you wouldn't let me. If you can tour 1 year, it'll take 4 years off your life. You know, 4 years, 5.
Blackie, simply put, was angrier than Lawrence Stroll after being accused of cheating.
I'm extremely angry.
So what did you think of, the movie Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, or Look at the Face? Penelope Spheres directed this wonderful film on the stage.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. He was not drunk. I mean, when your mother is sitting next to you and you're lying in a pool, he thought that he was going to be entertaining. I mean, the message that we're trying to put across with this record now, that totally contradicts everything that we're talking about.
He isn't actually drinking the vodka. He's pouring it in his mouth and, unlike what his mother should have done, isn't swallowing. He's spitting it all over himself, like a member of Downfall Network making futile attempts on trying to learn how to drink a glass of water for the first time. A real alcoholic, not knowing that this was pool water, would watch this video and scream, "You wasteful fuck."
The Headless Children comes out, and then you're no longer in the band. But what happened? I mean, were you fired? Was it an incident? Why'd you leave?
Oh, we do the Headless Children album. So there's some information found out about Blackie charging the producing fees on the other albums. And he said he didn't, and I found out from somebody that he did. And I asked him about it, and he goes, "Where'd you get your information? You're full of shit," he told me.
Okay.
And that was during the tour of that band, of the Headless Children.
Enter a bunch of hired guns consisting of Bob Kulick of Kiss, Alice Cooper, Meatloaf, and eventual Blackthorn fame, as well as drummer Frankie Banali of Quiet Riot. So now it was time to see if W.A.S.P was as good as they were because of a band effort consisting of Chris Holmes and Randy Piper, etc., or if the band's exceptional talent could be traced to exclusively Blackie Lawless.
Well, I get asked one question by the fans over and over, and they say, "Give me some advice. How do I get from where I'm at to where you're at?" So I tell them the same thing over and over again. I say, you really have to want this badly. And the one thing that they all say is, yeah, I want it, but they don't really understand what they're saying. So I thought, I'm going to tell them a story and paint them a picture, and I'm going to show them the worst possible side of this business.
Thanks to Chris Holmes fucking up the party, as well as record companies not wanting to pay the glam metal bands what they were worth after 1990, glam metal was all but dead before the year was out. After turning down the role of the T-1000 for Terminator 2 Judgment Day because Arnold Schwarzenegger's short man syndrome got the best of him, and spending a year writing the follow-up album to the Headless Children, and what would he grace us with but a concept album to end all concept albums? Most bands couldn't make a convincing concept album if King Diamond literally handed them a script. And while this was at the time intended to be a solo album, Blackie was convinced to release it as a W.A.S.P album. This was an ambitious risk considering W.A.S.P's origins, but the end result was The Crimson Idol, telling the story of a drunken, fumbling fuck-up Jonathan Aaron Steele, the black sheep of his family whose brother, the fan favorite of their parents, was killed in a car accident by a drunk driver. Johnny runs away from home, wandering the streets and becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol, and one night after turning tricks with Dee Dee to Ramone on the corner of 53rd and 3rd, he ends up walking past a music store and spots a crimson-colored BC Rich warlock, breaks the window with a bottle of Chris Holmes' pool water, and makes off with the guitar. After playing on the streets and somehow earning enough money to record an album, he gets shacked up with Chainsaw Charlie, the president of a major record label, and manager Alex Rodman shouldn't be a Columbo mystery on who he was modeled after. Despite achieving fame and fortune, but never really being able to fill the void of being viewed as anything other than a complete failure in the eyes of his parents, after a brief phone call with his parents at the height of his fame where no less than 50 words were spoken, 4 of which from his parents telling him that they have no son, he decides at the following concert to remove the strings from his guitar, shape them into a noose, and hang himself on stage. The story is only half the job. Now the question is the music just as good? If you want heavy, look no further than the murderous Chainsaw Charlie. if you want a good ballad, there's no slouches to choose from, seeing how this album is a tad bit ballad heavy, but the most notable is a song by the name of Gypsy Meets the Boy, based on Blackie getting his fortune told not once but twice, and being told the same exact thing both times, which is talked about in the song. This song was actually recycled from a certain underrated bonus track off the Headless Children, a song that absolutely should have been included on the actual album, but wasn't after advice from Rod Smallwood, as it shared the title of a certain Metallica tune. Blackie said he wanted to write this album to show the absolute worst things rock stars go through, and the man did not hold back, evidenced by the song Dr. Rockter, where Johnny does the Michael Jackson Dr. Chopin shuffle that I've personally seen all too often in my time trying to be in bands.
Stet Howland, who is pretty much for all intents and purposes W.A.S.P's second drummer. Not many people seem to know this, but while Frankie Banali was pretty much the main W.A.S.P drummer, Stet Howland was the drummer that Blackie would bring in when he needed more technical drumming done. Howland would appear on pretty much every single W.A.S.P album from the Crimson Idol all the way to the Neon God, before eventually becoming Metal Church's drummer.
If you want to listen to a concept album, and an actual good one at that, then the Crimson Idol is definitely a fucking requirement.
Like, I'd be talking to you right now and I'd look calm on the outside, but on the inside there was a Mardi Gras going on, and I'd question everybody's existence around me. I mean, it really got bad. So I hope I never have to face that beast again. But I was looking for subject matter, and I thought, here it is, it's staring me in the face. I want to tell people how I lost my brain, you know.
And you got it back?
Some of it. I mean, that's a good record, you know, but it came in the wake of the Crimson Idol, and nothing was gonna survive that.
Most classic metal bands always have that one album that I refer to as the 90s Dark Album, an album that's typically regarded as the neglected red-headed stepchild of the band's discography. For Iron Maiden, it was the X Factor. For Blue Oyster Cult, it's Heaven Forbid. For Accept, it's Objection Overruled or Death Row, you pick. For Tom Waits, it's Bone Machine. For Raging Slab, it's whatever the flying fuck this is supposed to be. For W.A.S.P, that 90s Dark Album would be Still Not Black Enough. And what an album. Still Not Black Enough is an album that could only be made in the 90s. Not to say it's outdated, in fact far from it, but it captures a moment in time when Blackie was at his most vulnerable, which could be described as a thematic concept album, as most of the songs on the album is about darkness, depression, descent into madness. But one of the two of my favorite songs on this album is the somewhat experimental horror film-esque song called Scared to Death. My other favorite that I rate equal to the former is the catchier than COVID's Skinwalker. And it even delves into politics because it's Blackie Lawless, and of course he'll go into political rants when he goddamn wants to. But this album's political statement talks of political correctness, especially the political correctness in music that was beginning to be quite obnoxious by this point. Blackie was, for lack of better words, in a dark place at the time. Blackie claims writing The Crimson Idol took a major toll on his mental health, but I believe there was more going on there than just that. Blackie did reveal he was in a serious relationship around this time, and even rumored to may have been engaged at one point, but Whether their breakup happened before or after this album remains unclear to this day. But if you think Blackie was fucked up before, you ain't seen nothing yet.
We understand that to make an omelet, you gotta break some eggs. And if that's the case, we're going and raiding the whole damn hen house.
By the time 1997 rolled around, metal was unrecognizable from what it was in the 70s and 80s. Grunge was thankfully long and dead after Kurt Cobain's untimely demise, but groove metal chugged along in its stead, and by the latter part of the decade, it was soon, thankfully, overpowered by the rise of industrial metal. Rammstein, 9 Inch Nails, and Alice Cooper's illegitimate alcoholic abomination offspring, Marilyn Manson, were the king at this point. And while in retrospect this subgenre aged about as well as a glass of milk in the Sahara, it had its moments. Hell, even David Bowie wanted in on the action, and there was not one single thing you could do about it. You could either shove a bottle of lube up your asshole and let it happen, or get dry docked by Blackie Lawless's knife dick. And that is exactly what happened with W.A.S.P's 1997 offering, titled by the family-friendly name of Kill Fuck Die. At this point in the music industry, metal songs with more pseudo-synth fuzz and pitched-down B-movie horror film samples than actual guitars were hard fucking core. Ask Prince, it was the sign of the times after all. But here's the thing, Kill Fuck Die isn't like that. Sure, there's fuzz and fuckery overlaid on the guitars and vocals, but underneath all of that, this album still sounds like something W.A.S.P could have released between the Headless Children and Still Not Black Enough. Kill Fuck Die wasn't exactly inspired by 90s industrial, but rather 80s proto-industrial.
It was the first time we came to Europe in '84. Chris and I went into a German disco, and we were just looking for girls. We didn't know what was in there. We heard this music, this sound going, and it sounded like two big pieces of steel colliding, but it's a beat. You know, they turned it into a drum beat, and that left a big influence on us.
Blackie doesn't say which bands exactly inspired him, but if I had to take an educated guess, it would be the band KMFDM. But that's not to say Kill Fuck Die wasn't at least inspired by the, at the time, current industrial scene. In fact, the title track directly references 9 Inch Nails' classic
Take it, now you can't take it, now you can't take that away from me.
But the real story was the return of guitarist Chris Holmes, whom Blackie helped get sober the year previous. And of course, when there's mention of killing, fucking, and dying, you know Chris Holmes wants in on that shit. Blackie had just gotten out of that aforementioned pretty serious relationship, and Chris Holmes had just finalized divorce with heavy metal's very own blow-up sex doll, Lita Ford. Needless to say, they were anti-relationship, hated women, and had no problem showing it in their music as well as on fucking stage.
The live show then, you debase women. I believe that you rape a nun with a knife.
Nuns kind
Nuns are different than women, aren't they?
My personal favorite might be the depressing and more down-paced affair by the name of My Tortured Eyes. The haunting, atmospheric album closer, The Horror, was based on cult classic Apocalypse Now. Even the screaming bonus track, Tokyo's on Fire, which was only intentionally ironically included on the Japanese releases of this album to replace the apparently too offensive Fetus and Little Death songs, is still fantastic. Funny how Fetus and Little Death were too offensive for Japan, yet a song called Tokyo's on Fire is perfectly fine. I'm reminded of one of my good friends who claims The Hills Have Eyes is his comfort film, and in the same vein, Kill Fuck Die is my comfort album, cause there's nothing more comforting than killing, fucking, and dying, am I right?
We did an album called KFD, and we brought that show to Europe here. That show really bent a lot of people out of shape, more so than what we had done And in the first few years that we came out, it was designed to make people real uncomfortable. The metaphors that we used, people did not understand the relationship or the correlation between some of the imagery that was going on. You know, I can do stuff for the sake of art, you know, and do it in my living room to 4 or 5 people that appreciate it, you know, or I can alienate my whole audience, you know, so there's a delicate balance there.
Helldorado, like Def Leppard's Euphoria, was a glam metal record released in 1999, which is like a new wave album being released in 2023. Now, I'll preface this by saying that W.A.S.P has never released a bad album, let alone a bad song, and I still love this album to death, but on the other side of that coin, this will probably be the closest you'll ever hear me get close to criticizing a W.A.S.P album in my entire life. I often wonder if Blackie made the choice on his own, or if Chris Holmes was being a pain in the ass about wanting to play the Motley Crue sleaze metal and continuously begging like a 5-year-old wanting ice cream before dinner until Blackie just said fuck it and gave in. Damnation Angels is definitely one of the standouts of this album, but then that song is followed up by the soundtrack to Charlie Sheen's Scrotum. Hell, the entire track list sounds like Blackie just lifted the song's names directly from Chris Holmes' diary while Chris was out in the doctor's office taking a chlamydia test. These song names would get laughed out of the room by fucking Guar and Anal Cunt. It just feels jarring going from Headless Children, The Crimson Idol, Still Not Black Enough, Kill Fuck Die, and then Helldorado. It gives the discography a 1 step forward, 5 steps back kind of feel.
It is not an attack on personal faith. It's about organized religion and the way it manipulates their people. But it's not just religion that does it either. Governments are famous for doing it to people. I mean, what you see on the news on television is really what the government wants you to see.
I am kings, I am queens, unholy terror's me. I'm the feces of the species, still you're all in all.
Now we're getting back on track, correcting the reversion back to the rock out with your cock out exploits of Helldorado. Unholy Terror was the Headless Children Part 2 electric boogaloo that W.A.S.P desperately needed. Although this time the album will be centered more around the criticism of organized religion, as Blackie had just become a born-again Christian. As someone who grew up in the Catholic Church myself, this album certainly hits the nail on its head as far as the absolute Bible-thumping holier-than-thou narcissism that the church has that turns more children away from the church rather than embracing it. But for me, there's 2 major standout songs on this album. The first is a 6-minute thrill ride known as Locomotive Man. Now, I know what you might be thinking, it's a song about trains. Actually, locomotive are separated into 2 words, so the real meaning of the title is loco, meaning crazy, and motive as in a reason for doing something. So altogether, the title means crazy motive man.
There's a phenomena that's going on not just in America, but it's happening in Britain, it's happening in Asia, where you see kids taking guns to school and shooting other kids at school. And it's a phenomena that's happening because parents start to believe that they can have the perfect marriage, the perfect life, the perfect family. You cannot have everything perfect. They work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. They cannot maintain a marriage, much less try to raise kids. So they have kids going to school that are screaming for attention. They say, please pay attention to me. And if they don't get the attention, I will make you pay attention to me.
The second standout is a 5 1/2 mini epic titled Charisma, which talks of televangelists religious leaders, dictators, and the Antichrist rising to power due to their charismatic personalities. Blackie goes as far as highlighting each line of lyric to tell who they were about, but one interesting note is that Blackie has also stated later that part of the song goes into specific detail about a certain up-and-coming Illinois state senator that was making his rounds at the time. Right from the onset with the anthemic Let It Roar to the kill shot Wasted White Boys, and everything in between is plain simple goodness, just like Elam Garrick. Even the Planet Caravan-esque Shroom Trip Euphoria brings something to the table. Unholy Terror is a sleeper standout amongst the 21st Century W.A.S.P albums, as well as the final W.A.S.P album to feature Chris Holmes and his killer guitar tone, which makes this album a must-purchase for any W.A.S.P fan. By the time Unholy Terror tour was underway, longtime band member Chris Holmes was once again kicked the fuck out. And don't let Wikipedia fool you when they say he left so he could play the blues, because it was and still is clear as day that is nowhere near the full story. Hell, Chris himself has continuously gone on record to say he was kicked out, albeit his claims on why he was kicked out remains to be based on complete fucking fiction.
I was told I was written in as one of the songwriters.
Okay.
And found out about 5 years ago that I was written in as a session player, you know.
Chris Holmes, great guitarist, probably one of the greatest in heavy metal history. Can't fucking stand him. While we have only heard one side of the story in the form of Chris Holmes slagging off Blackie anytime he's in front of a camera or a so-called journalist, as he goes on an all-out assault on Blackie on both of his absurdly painful to listen to solo albums.
I wrote a song on both my new albums. I got two new albums. One came out last year, and I wrote a song on there called The Loser.
You're on Earth because your mother had an anal birth.
And I got a new one on my new one called TFMF. I'm sure he writes one on his album about me every time.
Yeah, project much? Chris Holmes claims he's been sober since 1996, but after putting myself through the absolute torture that not even Al-Qaeda would see fit to perform on an infidel, the lie detector test has determined that was a lie. Either that or his record company are the ones hitting the sauce. Hell, they're not hitting the sauce, they're doing backflips off a diving board and diving dick first into the sauce. They're swimming in the sauce to the point where they're marinating in the fucking sauce. And I didn't know Blackie Lawless was so good at real estate that he could live in someone's head rent-free for 20 plus years. He should have his own Monopoly spin-off by this point. I mean, Chris is worse than Dave Mustaine at this point. At least Dave Mustaine was kicked out of Metallica, turned around and formed a band just as good, if not better. Seriously, I challenge you to find an interview with Chris Holmes where he doesn't go 9 billion miles out of his way to slag Blackie off. Let it go already. But then you make it very fucking hard to feel bad for you when you turn to, once again, the media to slag Blackie Lawless off for not paying your medical bills for cancer treatment. Chris, babe, you haven't been in W.A.S.P for 22 fucking years. Chris Holmes was once again out permanently this time, so it was once again time to wait another few years for the next W.A.S.P album, right? Right?
The September 11th incident made you make this?
Well, yeah, you know, it was in a lot of ways coming from the same direction that the Headless Children came from, where it was real social comment oriented. You know, I had gone to Ground Zero I'd been down there a week before it happened, you know, and I mean, literally was looking at those buildings and I thought, well, I'm going to be back in a few weeks. The day I got back, I went down to Ground Zero, and there's nothing you will ever see in your lifetime that can prepare you for what that was. When I was a kid, I could look out my bedroom window and I could see the trade centers. So for me, it was like somebody stole something out of my backyard.
after being extremely unhappy with releasing an album every year when they cranked out their first 3 albums and then taking a year to write The Headless Children and having that album come out as great as it was, Blackie continued to take his time with making each and every album afterwards, but 9/11 sent Blackie into a furious but rather productive binge of creativity, which the end result produced one hell of an album. Hallowed Ground is a harrowing song. Whether you know of its 9/11 backstory or not, it produces one of the most haunting choruses of the W.A.S.P discography. And it's so great that Blackie even included not one, but 2 alternate versions of the song. The second being a demo version of the song, which somehow conveys more emotion than the final album version, probably due to it being recorded and written almost immediately after 9/11.
Oh, sky's falling, and I don't know where my home is now.
One of the major standout songs comes in the form of Trail of Tears, inspired by one of the greatest atrocities the U.S. government ever made to happen. After the American Indian nations were enslaved and exiled into reservations and internment camps, a vast majority of the Cherokee Nation were made to march on foot. With very little food and drinkable water and absolutely no medical attention, over 4,000 died resulting from the march that took place. Dying for the World is a hurt and angry response to the tragedy that unfolded that fateful September day and is easily one of the most devastatingly deep W.A.S.P albums in the entire discography.
The Neon God. Can you tell me a little bit about this CD?
Who am I? Where am I going? Does my life have meaning? Has it got no meaning? Is there God? Is there no God? What's this all about? Why are we here? Retailers won't take double records anymore. They'll take historical double record sets like The Wall or something like that, you know, but they don't want to take new double records anymore. Their argument is it takes up too much rack space, and it's like, you know, hello, that's a lie. They want to maximize the amount of space. The reason I don't like it is because to me it's one piece of work, and since Part 2 has come out, Part 2 is being compared to Part 1. It should not be thought of like that. It's one piece of work.
If you thought the Crimson Idols plot was crazy and fucked up, you ain't seen nothing yet. Telling the story of Jesse Slane, whose abusive, drug-addicted mother abandoned him at 8 years old, 2 years after the death of his father, to the Sisters of Mercy orphanage, which doubled as an asylum, ran by nuns who practiced the good old days when nuns were all but encouraged to torture children. One in particular, Sister Sadie, took a liking to Jesse in all the wrong ways. After attempting to commit suicide, Jesse awoke to find himself in the asylum portion of the orphanage, dubbed Asylum Number 9. Making friends with other patients, lovingly nicknamed Spasmo and Serial Sam, and being furnished with all the Xanax, heroin, and Ketracel White he could possibly want, Jesse ironically had an easier time in the asylum than he did in the actual orphanage. That was until Jesse's best friend Billy took enough sleeping pills to make Heath Ledger jealous and died holding hands. Jesse receives word that Sister Sadie mysteriously woke up dead, and one morning, and soon after, Jesse was released from the asylum, and soon after, he escaped the orphanage altogether, living on the streets for 2 years surrounded by drug addicts, hobos, and or gigolos. But enough about Titusville. He came across a street magician with telekinetic abilities who taught Jesse that he too had the gift and helped him harness his abilities and manipulate the masses into giving them both money, then forming a full-on religion that rivals the Church of Scientology, and they form a billion-dollar industry. Jesse soon finds his face emblazoned across Times Square, where he is christened the Neon God. One day, though, Jesse finds his estranged mother along the flock, strung out on the Ketracel-grade drugs that were doubtlessly handed out during the Neon God masses, and realizes the depth and depravity of the deception and attempts to leave the cult. Unfortunately, his partner in crime, along with the bishops of the cult, decide that the Neon God would be more useful and profitable as a martyr rather than a leader. Anyone could come up with an intriguing story, but being able to line it alongside an equally intriguing album musically is where bands like Meme Theater shit the bed, albeit with them, they shit the bed in both areas. Blackie began writing this album in 1996, and there were bound to be some old W.A.S.P songs recycled, like For Whom the Bell Tolls was on the Crimson Idol in the form of Gypsy Meets the Boy, but in this case, the song Clockwork Mary is a certain under-the-radar song towards the tail end of Still Not Black Enough.
Let me go.
As I said in the Crimson Idol portion of this video, if you are looking for a concept album to listen to, The Neon God is a requirement.
How do you spend your time between concerts, or do you drink before concerts? Do you find the groupie? You after this. Next question.
On your knees today, the devil's begging to beg.
Welcome to Modern W.A.S.P. It's like Modern Maiden, but actually fucking good. Not even worth inhabiting the same solar system as albums like Dance of Death, The Final Frontier, and Senjutsu. Dominator is to W.A.S.P. what Brave New World is to Modern Maiden, except infinitely superior in every way. While it modernizes not only W.A.S.P's sound, but also Blackie's more prominent inclination to write more religious songs that rival Stryper's Christian metal output, but also manages to still sound like W.A.S.P. There is the Scorching the Burning Man, which quite possibly has one of the best arrangements from the verse into the chorus in W.A.S.P's discography, and leaves you more blown away than Jihadi John. And then of course you have the album's literal centerpiece, Heavens Hung in Black, widely considered to be the best song in W.A.S.P's latter-day output, dedicated to George W. Bush for all the wrong reasons.
Right now, as we speak, the United States and Great Britain are involved in an illegal, immoral, bullshit war down in Iraq. The American people and the world has been told more lies by George Bush than any other president since Richard Nixon.
Right at the end of Bush's last year in office, we were experiencing what a lot of people, politicians, were referring to as a global financial crisis. Crisis in political terms is code for watch out for your wallet. And I was also watching what was happening in the EU at the same time in Europe. And there was guys meeting in Brussels and discussing what was going on over there in the European community. And one guy was describing this supposed global financial crisis as a time for action to maybe create a new one-world government, like a one-world system. And then another guy says, well, you know, if we're going to have a one-world government, then we should have a one-world currency. And then a third guy spoke up, and he says that they believed that they could have all of the EU microchipped.
This is some scary, scary stuff these guys are talking about. And then I started thinking, you know, it reminded me 20 years ago when I wrote Headless Children. There's a line in the song that says, 4 horsemen sit high in the saddle and waiting, ride a bloody trail, no return. And I thought, are we closer to that apocalypse now than we were 20 years ago?
This album's greatness is nothing short of biblical, pun very much intended. One of the biggest standouts for me as an Elvis fan comes in the form of the album closer, a song everyone will recognize from the tunnel scene at the climax of the 1997 sci-fi action classic Men in Black.
You need to relax, learn to take some joy in your work. You like music?
California home of mine. Straddled that Greyhound and rode him in the Raleigh and on across Carolina. Down the left is Australia in downtown Birmingham. Right away to Fort Mill through team, take it right across Mississippi clean.
Oh, but it doesn't stop there. Blackie was making headlines for the music video of the pseudo-title track Babylon's Burnin', which displays famous dictators in the background with the, at the time, newly elected 44th President of the United States. Blackie Lawless is more well-read in the world of politics than most of the so-called political analysts on TV who are more partisan than the Grand fucking Canyon. Blackie doesn't pull any punches with any politician.
Golgotha is Hebrew for place of the skull, and it's the hill where Christ was crucified. And it's interesting when you see a lot of bands going around using satanic images or images of death and things like that, and I'm thinking all they need to do is look at the source. If you want death, there's enough to go around there.
That's because Jesus Christ is my nigga.
Despite the Stryper-esque album title and artwork, Golgotha is not primarily a Christian metal album. There's a song or two, including the title track that delves into the Jesus juice, but that's nothing different compared to the last two albums. And can I just say to the metalheads that complain about this, am I the only one that doesn't give a flying fuck? I mean, I'm agnostic and to be perfectly honest, I'm bordering on atheism at this point in my life, not to mention the fact that if Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath can write songs about religion, and damn good ones at that, what exactly is your deal with bashing bands like Stryper's entire discography or latter-day W.A.S.P albums? If the songwriting and musicianship is good, I couldn't give a flying fuck if the subject matter includes Yahweh or Jesus. Golgotha is a monstrous album and did something no album since the Headless Children did in 1989. Broke the Billboard Top 100. Best song, there's plenty to go around, but for me it's the screaming anti-globalist anthem, Slaves to the New World Order. That is all of the main studio albums done and dusted, but don't worry, we still have one more album to review. Briefly though, considering it is a re-recording of a certain concept album masterpiece, The Crimson Idol.
We re-recorded it because it was contractual obligation to do it for the soundtrack for the film. We had to do that because we could not do it. We could not use the original recordings the way they were.
The re-recording that honestly did not really need to be made. Typically, I don't really have any need for re-recordings unless it's to fix albums like Saint Anger or to showcase certain band members on songs that didn't originally feature them. But Reidolized is different in some ways in the sense that while it didn't really need to be made, it brought new things to the table, such as new tracks that fleshed the story out a little bit more.
There's a song that was on Golgotha on the last album called Miss You. Miss You was the very first song that was ever written for the Crimson Idol. That and a couple other songs never made it because at the time we were 2 years into recording the album and EMI was putting pressure on us saying we have to have something now. So I gave them what I thought was the closest thing to a completed story I could give them, something that still made sense.
And for that reason alone, Reidolized is absolutely worth buying, especially when it comes with the original Crimson Idol film, which I use the term film loosely considering it's more so just an album-length music video. But my only real criticism of this album comes in the form of changing lyrics, specifically in songs like Chainsaw Charlie. That sounds like shit you'd hear on fucking Cartoon Network. Especially when 5 tracks later, Blackie keeps a certain lyric that absolutely would not fly today if a white boy wrote it in today's society.
I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all.
My man Rik Fox can't be stopped. Unfortunately for me and other fans of the bonus track, Phantoms in the Mirror, I regret to inform you that a re-recorded version does not appear on Reidolized.
I thought the chorus was not as strong as it could have been. There was a lot of different coloration in the musical elements, and I thought to reproduce that would be extremely difficult to do.
But it's whatever, we still have the original version and it appears on the vastly superior original Crimson Idol, albeit you do need to get the 1998 remaster in order to listen to it. Overall, Reidolized only exists because they were contractually obligated to re-record the Crimson Idol in order to use it as the soundtrack to the accompanying film, which I won't even pretend to understand that logic. W.A.S.P just happens to be my all-time favorite heavy metal band, and for me it just wouldn't be right to not review them. I am Baphomet. Cheers, Metal Maniacs.
Subscribe to the Downfall Network.
No!